The tires of my old Ford Ranger crunched over broken branches as I eased it down the abandoned logging road. Dust swirled in the beams of my headlights, catching the last golden rays of sunset. I'd been driving for nearly an hour since leaving. The last paved road, and according to my GPS, I was now in the dead center of nowhere. Black Hollow Forest. No marked trails, no ranger stations. Just 200 square miles of untouched wilderness straddling the Maine Canada border. The kind of place that doesn't appear on most maps, where the trees grow so thick they blot out the sun. I killed the engine and stepped out, to the silence. The air smelled different here. Damp earth, pine resin, and something else I couldn't name. Something old. The forest stretched before me, a wall of shadow and towering pines. Perfect, I muttered to myself, pulling my backpack from the truck bed. I'd chosen this spot carefully. 3 days of solo hiking, just me and the wilderness. No people, no distractions, just the kind of isolation I craved after 6 months crammed. In a cubicle. The sun was nearly gone now. I'd have to make camp soon. I grabbed my gear and headed toward the tree line, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, needle-covered ground. That's when I noticed the first sign something was off. It was just a scrap of cloth at first. Red and frayed, tied around a low-hanging branch about 20 yards into the woods. I frowned and moved closer. The fabric was faded but not ancient, maybe a year or two old. Someone else had been here recently. Probably hunters, I told myself, though the placement seemed odd, too deliberate. Marked my own path with bright orange trail tape, tying strips to branches every 50 yards or so. Temporary, just enough to find my way back. The forest swallowed the sounds of my movement as I hiked deeper, the canopy thickening overhead until only slivers of fading sunlight made it through. An hour in, I found the first carving, a crude stick, figure, etched deep into the bark of a massive pine. The lines were uneven but deliberate, the kind of mark that would take years to fade. I ran my fingers over the grooves, frowning. Kids, probably. Teenagers messing around, but when I found the second one 10 minutes later, identical in style but with an extra limb and strange symbols beneath it, my skin prickled, then the third, and the fourth. Each slightly different, some with extra limbs, some with what looked like crude weapons, all watching the path ahead. That's when the birds stopped singing. The change was so sudden it made me freeze mid-step. One moment the forest had been alive with the chatter of squirrels, the distant call of a raven, the rustle of leaves. Then, nothing, absolute silence, even the wind had died. My hand went to the knife on my belt. I stood perfectly still, listening. That's when I heard the first whisper, just a breath really, the softest exhale coming from somewhere behind me, close enough that I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. I spun around, knife drawn. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Hello? My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. No response. I forced myself to breathe. Just the wind, I muttered. But there was no wind. I should have turned back then. But something pushed me forward. Curiosity, stubbornness, maybe just plain stupidity. The carvings became more frequent. Every few trees now, another twisted little figure watching me pass. The symbols beneath them grew more complex. Spirals, jagged lines, what looked like crude houses. Then I smelled smoke. Not the sharp, clean scent of a campfire, something older. Danker, like wet wood burning low and slow. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed it. The clearing wasn't large, maybe 30 feet across. The ground had been trampled flat, the smaller trees hacked away. In the center stood a ring of blackened stones surrounding a pile of cold ash, and above it, hanging from the branches like some kind of nightmare mobile, were the dolls. Dozens of them, made of sticks and twine, their bodies knotted together, their heads hollowed out acorns with faces scratched into the shells. Some were fresh, the twine still tight. Others were rotting, black with mold, their limbs dangling by threads. The largest hung directly over the ashes, its acorn head split open to reveal something dark and shriveled inside. I took an involuntary step back and froze. My trail markers were gone. Every single strip of orange tape I'd tied to the branches had vanished. In their place, tiny stick figures dangled from the same spots, swaying slightly in the dead air. Someone had been following me. Someone had untied my markers and replaced them. That's when I heard the rustling in the trees around me. Not from one direction, from all of them. I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I didn't care about stealth anymore, just distance. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples.